Hello, my name is Jennifer Shlomovich, and I am a vegan confidence coach. I specialize in helping vegans eliminate people-pleasing so they can confidently be themselves and navigate the challenges of having a lifestyle different from the people around them. Here on my channel, The Confident Vegan, I share a variety of supportive resources, including inspiring interviews and recipe videos. Today, my special guest is Meg Kelly, who is an advocate for veganic gardening and farming. In 2008, she co-founded the Veganic Agriculture Network to promote plant-based organic food systems, and she recently organized the first online Veganic Summit. An avid gardener, Meg has been growing food veganically for 15 years in backyards, on balconies, and in the countryside. She now teaches the Learn Veganic online gardening course to empower people around the world to grow their own fruits and vegetables at home using sustainable veganic techniques. Welcome, Meg.
Hi there, Jennifer. Thanks so much for having me here.
It's great to have you here. I have been wanting to learn more about this topic. I haven't done a garden in a really long time. The last time I did it was maybe 20 years ago before I was vegan. And then in April, I started seeds in the house. And then it hit me. And then I realized, oh my God, certain soils aren't vegan. I didn't really even think about it. And then you start reading all the different ingredients in there, and then even organic ones. And then I finally just didn't know what to do. Was an organic choice, but I ended up just getting a bag of Miracle Grow because I didn't see any non-vegan ingredients in it. But I definitely want to learn for next year because I feel like this is such an important thing to know, and it can be overwhelming with all the information out there. So I'm really excited to have you on here to talk about this.
Wonderful, Jennifer. I know the feeling too. I've sometimes walked into garden centers and looked at all the bags and thought, there's nothing here that's vegan and organic, and so yeah, we'll talk about some of the strategies we can use for that to help navigate that.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to learning from you today. But before we get started, what is your vegan story?
So I became aware as a kid, that meat was made from animals when I was maybe about 6 years old, and I was very put off by it. And a few years later, when I was about 11, I decided to stop eating cows and pigs. And then it took me a few more years to really make that decision to stop eating all animals and to stop eating all animal products. One of my big influences, kind of in the early 2000s, was Vegan Street. Vegan Street was one of like the main websites at the time that had lots of info and that kind of challenged a lot of the myths and a lot of our kind of hesitations around going vegan. And then I also went to the Toronto Veggie Food Fair and learned a lot there, and maybe met vegans for the first time in my life while I was there, and that helps normalize it. So when I was kind of in my late teens, early 20s, I made the transition to being vegan, and it was one of those things that it just took me quite a while to finally align the way I was eating with my ethics. And, I wish I had done it sooner, but I'm glad that I got there.
I find that that's usually the typical journey that a lot of us vegans have taken. For me, it took me a couple years where it first started with a sensitivity to dairy that I discovered. And I also wanted to eat healthier. And so I did an experiment to cut out dairy and for 30 days, and I felt a lot better. Like there was ways dairy was making me feel bad that I didn't even realize it was making me feel bad. Like that was my normal operating system. And I was like looking up all these different recipes for dairy-free recipes on Pinterest, and I discovered a lot of vegan recipes, which then I saw this whole exciting world of creativity with vegetables and just different, and making healthier versions of desserts and just using spices I'd never even used before. But it took me a couple years because I was afraid of how people were going to judge me. I knew my family didn't want to be vegan. And so it took me a couple of years of just going back and forth a little bit, eliminating stuff here, eliminating stuff there, and until I was finally ready to make that transition. And I love having people share their stories on my channel because I feel like it shows there's no one way to become vegan. There's no right or wrong way. It's doing what's right for you, but eventually you finally get there. So, everyone's journey is unique to them. And so, can you tell us a little bit more about veganic gardening and what led you to get into that?
Yeah, so veganic gardening, in terms of what it is, it's organic gardening without using any animal byproducts. So when we look at how we can garden, one way to garden is with chemicals. Another way is to garden organically using animal products, which is very, very frequent. So if you go to a gardening center, for example, you might find things like blood meal, bone meal, fish emulsion, cow manure, chicken manure, and things like that in the kind of organic gardening section. Another way to garden is to say, I want to take everything that's awesome about organic, but not use any of the animal products, and I want to do it in a plant-based way. And that's basically what veganic is. It's
Mhm.
vegan organic gardening. And so I got into that around 2008. I started becoming interested in how to grow my own food and then realized it was more complicated than I thought, and it wasn't as vegan as I imagined it might be. And I was really lucky at the time. I became friends with someone named Stefan Groslo, and he had been researching veganics for several years at that point and experimenting with it and putting it into practice. And so he became my friend and then also my mentor in terms of growing veganically. And I started gardening with him. So I was really lucky that I was able to garden veganically right from my very first year. And having someone kind of show me the ropes and who had already put a lot of systems in place to veganize them. Um, and then, yeah, around that time, I co-founded the Veganic Agriculture Network to kind of promote veganics, especially in North America. And that's been one of my main forms of activism for the last 15 years or so, is promoting veganics. And we've really started to promote it more even in the last 3 or 4 years with the Learn Veganic gardening course and the Veganic Summit, to try to offer educational experiences to more people so that they can also learn how to veganize their gardens.
That's great. And I feel like it's such an important skill to learn. And even if it's just growing your own herbs, right?
For sure, for sure.
Something as simple like that that you can grow inside, like in a windowsill. Like I feel like it's such an important skill. And there's something very satisfying too, like watching, your plant go from a seed to where it is now. Like I have right now I have I have little baby cucumbers forming right now. So it's like so exciting. So there is something very like just satisfying about watching something from a tiny little seed just grow and evolve.
Yeah, I just planted a lot of seeds about a week or two ago, and I'm just watching them all pop up out of the ground right now. And you're right, it is an incredible thing just to kind of participate in some of these natural processes and to start with something as tiny as a seed and just to, yeah, watch it grow over the whole season.
Yeah, definitely. And what are some of the benefits of gardening the veganic way?
Well, one of them, of course, is for the animals and to have a way of gardening that's, aligned with the vegan ethic because, as you've experienced yourself, if you're a vegan and you walk into a garden center, it's awfully nice if you can come away with a vegan solution where you know that you're doing um, something that really, aligns with your values and is beneficial for animals. But there are some other benefits too, from an environmental standpoint. We
Hmm.
know, for example, that having a plant-based diet is much more efficient for the environment. It's much better for the environment to eat plants. And it's the same when we fertilize. If we have farms and gardens that are reliant on animal agriculture, well, then they're reliant on all of the environmental problems that come with animal agriculture. And if we want to
Yeah.
see a future that's much more environmentally friendly, well, veganic gardening and veganic farming is part of that solution. And another thing that's a benefit is that it actually really reduces the number of contaminants that come into the food supply. When we think of organic, especially, we imagine that organic sort of means contaminant free, but there are a lot of contaminants that can still end up in the organic food supply. And one of
Oh,
the main
wow.
ways is through the animal byproducts that are used. And one thing that's really surprising, this isn't necessarily true for every country, but in North America, basically, organic fertilizer is fertilizer that comes from an animal, vegetable, or mineral origin. And so it can be kind of factory farm waste from non-organic animals.
Oh,
It can be
wow.
used in organic agriculture as a fertilizer. So there can be things like pesticide residues, antibiotic residues, and heavy metals and things like that that end up in the organic food supply because of animal byproducts. And they're also ending up in the non-organic food supply because of animal byproducts too. And when we think about things like E. coli outbreaks. Sometimes there might be, things like spinach recalls and lettuce recalls because of like salmonella outbreaks or E. coli outbreaks. That's generally coming from the manure. So it could be because of manure in fertilizer or just because there's a farm nearby that has animals or things like that. But, there are certainly more dangers with using animal-based fertilizers compared to plant-based fertilizers. So if we just want something that's a lot safer for us to interact with in our gardens, going plant-based helps with that too. So there's a whole bunch of advantages. And another advantage too is, when we do veganic gardening in a way where we make our own fertilizers instead of buying them. And usually with veganic, we end up making our own because there's not a whole lot available on the market. So by default, we might end up making our own fertilizers. It can actually be a lot cheaper too. If you can grow your own fertilizer in your own backyard or make your own fertilizer at home, it can end up being significantly cheaper than, buying all sorts of bags of fertilizer.
Wow, that's really interesting. I feel like even if someone is not a vegan, but just knowing that there could be contaminants, in if they're doing organic gardening, or like you were mentioning, I saw a documentary on Netflix a couple months ago. I can't remember the name of it, but it talked about things in the food system and about those recalls that have happened and how people have gotten salmonella poisoning, all because of, it was near the fields where like the lettuce grew, was like not far from a farm where they were raising beef cattle, and then it rains or something and then it just washes it all down and you don't realize all these things are connected. And so yeah, that's a really good point. If you're having fertilizer, that's coming from manure that came from cows that ate a diet that was contaminated, that's going to still end up contaminating your organic soil. So I never even thought about that.
Yeah, yeah. Some of these things are very far-reaching, and some of them are a bit counterintuitive too. As I said, if something has an organic label, you just kind of assume that means it's being vetted. You assume that means everything's okay with it. But, here where I live in Canada, there's a lot of organic fertilizer that's certified for use in organic agriculture that is just dehydrated factory farm chicken manure. That's what it
Wow.
is. And it's somehow still certified for use in organic gardening. And so organic gardeners use it with a clean conscience because they just assume that because it's got that label on it, it means that everything's a-okay. And yet there's all of these problems behind it that aren't really being addressed.
Wow. Yeah. So you're doing some really important work because it sounds like you're working with farmers and gardeners of all levels and space availability. And I feel like that's great because the more this information gets out there, sometimes people feel like, oh, what's the point? How can I make a difference? But if enough people make a difference, it'll spread.
Yeah, for sure. And also in our own gardens, the nice thing is we can make our own decision, right? Like when we get stuff from the grocery store, we have basically no control over how it was grown. We just have to accept what's in the grocery store for what it is.
Hmm.
But when it comes to our own gardens, the really awesome thing is that's where we have, much more empowerment and we can say, okay, I want to do a garden, that is totally plant-based and I'm going to, take the steps to make that happen. So that's one reason that I love the gardening side of things because we can really veganize our own gardens.
Yeah, I love that. And what are some of the challenges that typically come up when somebody is switching to veganic gardening?
So as I mentioned with veganics, often we're making our own fertilizers, which has tons of advantages from an environmental standpoint, from a cost standpoint. But it means that we need to learn how to do a few more things. So there is a bit more time and effort put into learning. It's not quite as easy as going to a garden center and just buying a bag of manure. And the other thing is some of these things take a little bit of time. One of the best things we can do from a veganic perspective is make our own compost. But if we
Hmm.
start making our own compost today, it might not be ready for use in our garden for a few months or even until our next gardening season. So some of these things with veganic, we do need to be thinking ahead. We might need to devote a bit more space in our backyard for growing our own fertilizer or making our own compost or things like that. And one way I've described it before is that being a veganic gardener today is a bit like being vegan in the 1970s. People who were vegan in the 1970s, they were making their own tofu, they were making their own, veggie burgers, and today people can just go out and buy that all really easily. Veganic is still definitely more grassroots, and
Hmm.
it's not, in most countries, it's not quite as easy as just buying something. And if you do buy something, it might be more expensive than you were expecting. I would love to see a future in which you can walk into any garden center and buy veganic fertilizers and have them be the same price and just as easily accessible. There are a few things that you can buy that are veganic that are pretty easy to find, like alfalfa meal and alfalfa pellets.
Oh.
You can find those in a lot of garden centers, or sometimes they're sold as food for horses. So you can basically buy alfalfa pellets that were meant as horse food, as it's 100% alfalfa without anything else added to it. That's a super easy veganic fertilizer. So there are a few things that you can buy that are fairly accessible and fairly inexpensive. But most things you're going to need to be willing to do a little bit more to make it happen. And sometimes it can take us a little bit of time to veganize our gardens. With becoming vegan in terms of diet, you can kind of clear out your cupboards, just replace it all with vegan food, and you can kind of become vegan overnight. With a garden, you can start making compost now. It's just you might not start gardening until next summer once you've got that
Hmm.
compost ready. So some of these things just involve making a few strategic decisions a few months ahead of time or a year ahead of time so that when you come to that next round of plants in your garden, you've got something to feed them with.
Wow, yeah, that's something to good to think about. So maybe anyone who's watching this now, you
Start
could start
composting.
planning, right? If you start planning now, then you'd be prepared, and then you get into that new habit, right?
Yeah.
It's like then you're always thinking the year ahead and starting that next batch of soil. And so, what are some tips that you have for anyone who's switching over to veganic gardening? Like you mentioned composting, like how does one start doing that, for
Yeah,
example?
composting is honestly the easiest thing to get started with. It's going to be one of the most helpful things that you can do. So, first of all, we should all be composting, whether we garden or not, because anytime you take your food scraps and you send that off to the landfill, there's a couple
Mhm.
of things that happen. One is that those food scraps are going to get buried under a bunch of garbage. When they get buried there and there's no oxygen, they don't compost. Instead, they produce a bunch of methane, which is a really powerful greenhouse gas. So from an environmental perspective, it's best to not send our food scraps to the landfill. And when we send them to the landfill, we're also losing nutrients forever. There's all sorts of great nutrients in there, and if they end up under a bunch of garbage, you're never getting that back. So basically, composting from an environmental perspective is fantastic, and then it'll also set you up to be a veganic gardener. So my favorite recipe for composting, because it's so simple, is to take basically one handful of food scraps and mix it with two handfuls of autumn leaves. So
Hmm.
in the fall, one of the best things you can do is collect a whole bunch of autumn leaves, whether it's from your property or from some other places in your neighborhood. Um, you can store them in bags under your porch, or you could put them in a pile, at the corner of your yard or whatever it may be. But basically, you know, 2 parts autumn leaves, 1 part food scraps, mix them together. It makes a really nice compost. So the biggest kind of way that people fail at composting is by only putting their food scraps in. Sometimes people will
Ah.
just put their food scraps in, And then that actually just rots and it smells because it's not compost, it's just rotting food scraps. So you really need to mix it with something that's higher in carbon. Something that's higher in carbon could be uh, something like sawdust from untreated wood, or it could be little sticks, or it could be straw. But I find that the easiest thing to find is fall leaves. Most of us have fall leaves that just happen to be falling in our neighborhood anyway. Um,
Yeah.
and you know, even at this time of year, you might still be able to find some. You know, sometimes in some city parks, they'll pile all the fall leaves in one corner in a forest or something, and you can go grab a few.
Mhm.
Um, but basically, you just mix them together, and you can just aerate it occasionally with something like a stick or a pitchfork. Get some oxygen in there. And over the course of a few months, it's going to break down. Depending on your climate, it could be as little as 2 or 3 months. It can take up to a year. It kind of depends what type of materials are in there, what your temperature's like. Where I live, I'm in Canada, so it'll freeze during the winter. It'll become like kind of a frozen block. And then in the spring, it'll unfreeze and it'll just pick up where it left off. And you don't have to worry about adding anything else special to it because there's already all sorts of bacteria and fungi on the food and on the leaves, and they'll just start breaking it down. And usually worms will move in on their own and start breaking it down too. If there's no worms that move in, it's not a problem. They're not necessary for the process. And if somebody's in a situation, for example, where they're in an apartment or they might be moving in a year or things like that. There are some solutions there. There's a type of composter that's called a tumbler composter. And that's one that's kind of on little legs. And then if you can imagine kind of a barrel where you can open it up, a little trap door, put in your food scraps, put in your leaves, and then close it. And you can actually spin it. And that's something you could actually move, for example, to a new apartment, or you could put it on a balcony, you could have it in a parking lot or something like that. It doesn't have to be in direct contact with the ground. And we have a friend who invented a little composter, very, very small, only good for one person who doesn't produce many food scraps, but it's a balcony compost where basically he takes a bottomless bucket and plops it inside of a much bigger gardening pot. And then
Mhm.
there's kind of a ring between the two where he puts soil and grows a few plants and then just composts in the bucket that's in the middle. And so there's kind of concepts like that where even if you had something like a balcony, you could still do some composting. So we found that we've been able to compost in pretty much any context. And that's really the best thing that you can do to get started. Another thing that's pretty awesome to do, one thing I'm a fan of, is growing clover. So
Mm.
many of us have lawns that have grass in them. Grass is cool. Grass is something else that you can add to your compost bin. If you take a handful of grass and mix it with some autumn leaves, that can become compost too. But if you can manage to get some clover growing in your lawn, just mixed in with the grass, or maybe a nice ornamental patch of clover at the side of your lawn or something like that, clover is super cool because it's a legume plant. And what
Oh.
legume plants do is they actually take nitrogen from the air because there's nitrogen all around us. And the legume plants will take nitrogen from the air and they'll put it into the legume plant. And basically, you can then cut down that legume plant around the time it's flowering and you can feed it to your garden. And it will actually become a source of fertilizer to your garden. So it's kind of a
Wow.
way that you can take like the nitrogen that's around us in the air right now, put it into clover, feed your garden with that, and suddenly your plants have some new nitrogen just from the essentially from the air that was in your neighborhood. So there's some super
Wow.
cool things like that we can do that make it so that we end up with fertilizer that's super environmentally friendly and that's free too. Um, and one thing I want to mention is there's way more techniques than this, and we actually made a guide to 20 veganic materials for your plant-based garden.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
yeah, so people can get that guide at learnveganic.com/materials. And it's a free guide because sometimes with veganics, people think there's only one or two things you can do, like making compost, and that's it. So in that guide, we show some other techniques like using really nutrient-dense plants like nettles and comfrey that you can grow in order to feed them to other plants. There's
Hmm.
also ways that you can even use little small branches that have been chipped up where you can use that strategically to build up the soil in your garden. So there's all sorts of techniques that we can use. And what I kind of recommend to people is to look around their neighborhoods and try to find out which materials do you have access to. Because, we're all going to have access to different materials. And the good news
Mm-hmm.
is there's such a wide variety of ways to do it. There's not necessarily just one right way to do it. It's kind of like that question of what am I going to have for dinner and what are you going to have for dinner, right? They can be totally different, but still both be awesome. And in terms of how we garden veganically, it's similar. They can just, the ways that we choose to garden can look so different depending what space we have available, what materials we have available, what our goals are. So we try to show people that wide variety of possibilities so that people can like pick the type that works the best for them.
Wow, I love that. And yeah, that's really interesting and something I definitely want to check out. Like I live in an apartment and have a balcony, so I would have to figure out a way to like do something, but it sounds like it's doable. Now, how much compost can I guess it depends on the container that you put it in based on how much you get.
Yeah, so I mean, you're going to have two main things that determine how much compost you get. One is, I mean, the main thing is how much material did you put into your container? And then
Hmm.
the other limiting factor is how big of a container do you have room for? So certainly on a balcony, you're going to be a bit more limited in the space. Someone who has a backyard garden, for example, they might be able to go to a health food store every week and say, can I please have all of the fruits and vegetables that you're throwing out because they're going off? And so
Oh,
someone in
wow.
that situation might be able to get lots and lots and lots of composting materials to make huge amounts of compost. Whereas in your case, you might have the opposite, which is to say, I don't have much space, but I've got a lot of food scraps. How can I deal with this as effectively as possible? There's another technique that you can use that's called bokashi, and
Hmm.
it's different than composting. Basically, it involves pickling your food scraps. So you kind
Huh.
of have an indoor container where you try not to let any oxygen in, and you sprinkle in some bran that was inoculated with microorganisms. And it's very similar to making pickles. And then that's something that you could kind of bury in your balcony garden pots afterward.
Hmm.
Um, the only thing about bokashi is that sometimes the microorganisms come from a vegan source and sometimes from a non-vegan source. So if you kind of purchase bokashi starter, you kind of have to verify whether it was from a vegan source first. But
Okay.
that's, for somebody who's kind of trying to compost indoors in a vegan way, there aren't too many options. So bokashi is a nice alternative for that.
Well, I never even heard about that, but this has been really, really helpful. I've learned so much from you already and become aware of a lot of stuff. So it sounds like your website, your guide is a really good resource. Before we wrap up, are there any other resources that you would like to recommend to viewers?
Yeah, for sure. I will recommend just one of our favorite books here. Our friend Jimmy Videlli recently put out the Veganic Grower's Handbook.
Hmm.
So that's a lovely book if you're interested in learning how to garden veganically throughout the seasons. And I'm going to mention too, of course, our Learn Veganic gardening course. So that's a course that we offer where it's a course with about 12 hours of video lessons for how
Oh,
to garden
wow.
veganically in a lot of different contexts, from balconies to backyards, and it's even appropriate for people who want to do big projects too. And that's a course that also comes with group Q&A meetups. So we kind of get together and we have, 1 hour Q&As together with other veganic gardeners so that we can troubleshoot people's gardening questions and try to figure out solutions and also just build community too, because oftentimes we don't know other veganic gardeners in our neighborhood. So it's nice to connect with other people who are gardening veganically or in the transition to veganic gardening. And I would also like to mention that we offer now a once a year a Veganic Summit.
Hmm.
And so it's a 3-day event that's free for people to join. And the next Veganic Summit is happening from November 8th to 10th, 2024. We're going to put up a waiting list that people can join in a couple of weeks. And then we're going to open up registrations around September, October. But that's something just to at least keep your eye out for. And if you go to learnveganic.com and you join our newsletter, you'll be informed about all of our activities, including courses and the upcoming Veganic Summit. So if you get the free guide, you'll also be added to our newsletter where you can get all of the updates. So that's the best way to stay in contact with us. And you can also check out our Facebook and our Instagram. We're there as Learn Veganic. If you follow us there, you're going to get all sorts of little gardening tips and some inspiration from some of the plants that we're growing.
That's great. I'll also include a bunch of the links that you shared in the notes below this video. So if you want to check all of that out, I will also have that down below the video. This has been really great, Meg. I've learned so much, and I love that you're creating this community of support and education. Like you mentioned before, back in the 70s, vegan was just, very, everyone had to DIY everything. And you're part of something great, by educating people and creating that awareness. And it sounds like you're making it fun, right? Like, and when you take on something new, it can be overwhelming. So having that community support and all those guides that you have, it sounds like you have ways to meet people wherever they are in the journey.
Yeah, and we make it fun because we want it to be fun too. And gardening is just, as you mentioned before, such a wonderful adventure. So, we'd really like to invite people to try it, even if you haven't gardened before, just to get started. Start with your first plants, and again, just connect with us at Learn Veganic, and we'd love to offer you some tips for how to make that successful.
Great. Well, thanks, Meg, for joining me today. I was really nice chatting with you and learning all of this information. And thank you all for tuning in. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.